Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the crowd on a momentous week. All across the Western world, people are saying this process of globalization is not working for me. And what's striking is the large numbers of people who are signing up to a variety of populist narratives, particularly white men. And I was looking at some polling data for the US elections, and if you remove all the women from that polling, Donald Trump would win a landslide victory to a size that has not been seen for 60 years. And I think that is very telling. Business has, or can undoubtedly take credit for the improvements in the lifestyles that we've all grown accustomed to, but I think it's very clear that business is also fanning the flames of populism with its focus on the shareholder over society. The zero-hour contract was created by business, not by the worker. Business seems to be quite comfortable with high levels of income inequality. A lot of our tech stars are disrupting sectors that have provided continuous employment for some time. The list goes on, and we're all familiar with it. I think the big question is whether business can refresh its contract with society before it is too late, before the rise of populism leads to the rise of the outsider in politics, and whose mandate may be strong and brutal and not what business wants. And if we see the community of corporate sustainability folk, which is what a lot of people in this room would identify with, as the guardians of that relationship between business and society, we have to ask ourselves, are we focusing on the right issues? Because a lot of the traditional issues in sustainability of climate change, resource efficiency, are not the issues that are top of the agenda for society at the moment. Do we need to ask more awkward questions of our businesses around pay disparity, of our contributions to regional skills disparities, of how our business models impact communities, and possibly of fair tax? Do these questions get us much closer to the real purpose of business? So tonight we are not asking small questions, and we're very grateful to all our sponsors for allowing us to ask these questions, to Bank of America Merrill Lynch for hosting us here tonight. Our moderator this evening is Michael Skapinka. Michael is the Business and Society Editor at the FT. It's the first time he's moderated one of our panels, so a special welcome tonight. We have a guest tweeter on the crowd Twitter handle. It is the notoriously irreverent Ed Gillespie, who's just tapping away, putting a tweet in as I write. And it just remains for me to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Helena Morrissey. Helena is a remarkable woman. She led Newton Asset Management as CEO for 15 years until very recently. She is chair of the Investment Association, a trade body whose members manage £5 trillion. She founded the 30% Club, which is getting female representation of boards up the agenda. She's championed a number of social issues and environmental issues, and I'd wager she is somebody to watch in the years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, Helena Morrissey.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Jim, for his very kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. Speaking after the financial crisis in his inaugural address, the President of the United States said, "The measure of restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. There must be an end to a conduct in banking and in business which too often has given to a sacred trust the likeness of callous and selfish wrongdoing. Restoration calls, however, not just for changes in ethics alone. This nation asks for action, and action now. The problem is that those weren't the words of President Obama as he took office in January 2009. They were the words of President Roosevelt in March 1933, 83 years ago. Now, I'm sure that, like me, you think it's fine to make mistakes as long as we learn from them. But collectively, and rather depressively, we seem to keep repeating not just similar or small mistakes, but almost identical and very sizable ones, costing huge amounts of destruction, war, and obviously societal pressures, such as we're here to discuss tonight. The Communist Manifesto, written in 1848, almost 170 years ago, characterizes the history of society as a history of class struggles. Freemen and slaves, patricians and plebeians, guild members and journeymen, in short, oppressors and oppressed, who have always stood in direct opposition to each other. Marx and Engels describe this as a never-ceasing struggle, which has invariably ended either in a revolutionary alteration of the social system or in the common destruction of the contending classes. Now let's use the shocking accuracy of those extremely long-standing words as a jolt to change the trajectory today, to break the cycle and the supposed inevitability, which I don't accept, of a never-ceasing and destructive struggle from here. I think if we recognize what is playing out, if we look and we learn from history, which seems so difficult often to do, and we decide consciously to take a very different approach, we can create a new possibility. A solution can be found, but it is only by moving very deliberately, very consciously from opposition, those two oppositions between the oppressed and the oppressor, as they put it, towards conciliation, from duality to unity of purpose. Now, I don't believe that this is the path that we are currently on, but there are specific characteristics about our own age today that make a new direction possible if we only can see the opportunity. Well, first of all, of course, we have to recognize that we have a problem if we're going to start to solve it and diagnose it properly. Now, I think all of us tonight recognize that we have a problem, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. And I believe the events of this year, the recent past, and perhaps the imminent future too, speaking, of course, on the eve of the rather momentous presidential election, should be getting us to the point of recognizing, a wider recognition rather, that there is a problem, that society is broken or at the very least is damaged. Now, I was in Minneapolis last week, and there people were very interested to know, as if I represent the whole of Britain, what the British were thinking about the whole US presidential election process. It was slightly tricky to know where to start, really. But they agreed that there was so much wrong with the whole process, everything from the money involved to the circus-like quality of the campaign, and also that whatever the outcome, more problems seemed to lie ahead. I suggested to them that it was surely a good time to review the whole process, that there must be another way of electing a president. And they basically said, what a good idea, but no one's suggesting that. Now, we as human beings have created these problems. They haven't been forced upon us by some other. And so I believe that we have the power to fix them. And as the intensity, as the incontrovertibility of the problems becomes clearer, that's why really I have hope that there will be a broader recognition and that we may be able to find a healing path, and we must. Let's look back at what's happened over the past decade to what has brought us to this point. Now, obviously, the expression broken Britain has been oft used since 2008, the financial crisis, and of course, famously by the Sun newspaper, mostly to denote then an erosion of values. David Cameron talked about a broken society extensively following the summer 2011 riots. But he placed his emphasis then on restoring law and order, on protecting the lawful majority from the lawless few. And the focus was on this drunken, amoral, and irresponsible youth. Cameron talked of the theft of flat screen TVs, which became sort of symbolic and as simply theft to be punished. But of course, it's been clear for a while that complex and wide-ranging factors contributed to this supposed disintegration of morality and social behaviors. At the time, of course, a lot of unresolved anger over the financial crisis, where those who were deemed most accountable for that meltdown were still in charge afterwards. As well, we've obviously had a big shift in the skill sets needed for the jobs market in today's and tomorrow's world, and widening wealth inequality, both regionally and from top to bottom of society. And all of that has clearly created huge pressure points and the alienation of big groups of our society. Now, in 2008, in 2009, 10, 11, there were, of course, considerable efforts made to restore trust between business and the rest of society. And there were so many conferences on the subject, for example, and it wasn't all talk. There were a number of actions taken. So regulation has been tightened, and of course there have been efforts to address the realization that groupthink amongst the narrow elite had been a major causal factor behind the financial crisis. But I think what's been wrong is that these efforts have either been quite siloed, very sort of one thing separated from another, or they've been made in too much of an incremental, very gradualistic way. For example, and I take some of the responsibility here, through my work on the 30% Club, we've spent a lot of effort on improving gender balance in corporate boards, but my worry is that then that slightly distracted people from recognizing, or querying whether the boardroom discussion has really shifted. And really what we need to do at this stage, and I hope tonight will be part of that, is to call into question the very fundamental ways we create sustainable value in our businesses, the ways we govern ourselves and our businesses, where we educate our children so that they have the right skills for today's world, and how do we create community spirit. Now, if you feel this is being a bit harsh, that we have made more progress, let's look at the outcomes. It is now 8 years since the financial crisis, 5 years on from the riots, and the reality is that the developments this year, for 2016, suggest, I would contend, that we are no closer to resolving these underlying issues. On the big political issues of the year, the consensus among business leaders and mainstream politicians has been wrong almost without exception. Brexit, the rise of Trumpism, the explosion of populism across Europe, all are symptoms of a huge shift in power. And I think many people in leadership positions are either oblivious to this or in complete denial. So I think the gulf between leaders and workers has widened, not narrowed, in almost every sense, and particularly financially and around our respective points of view. And if we are to avoid further deterioration or even another full-scale economic or political crisis or social crisis, we urgently need to take a much more extensive, much more radical, and yet somewhat more nuanced approach to creating a solution. Of course, technology has heralded a massive revolution in communications, and it's exponentially increased the amount of information available to us all, in turn transforming our individual and our collective ability to influence and to network. And that's been largely, I think, behind the change in power. So we've seen a big erosion of hierarchical command and control, vertical power structures, and those are being replaced with much more diffuse and democratic frameworks. Now this gives us all new and unprecedented power to communicate, to learn from each other, and to influence what happens next. I last spoke at the crowd in response to a keynote from Lord Brown a little while ago, and he talked then on the subject of his most recent book, Connect, urging businesses to connect with society. Now, I totally agree with Lord Brown that that's incredibly important, but I would suggest that while his book's been very well received, there's scant evidence that business leaders are really heeding his advice. At this point, I am genuinely really concerned that there's in fact much more evidence of a digging in of heels rather than any reaching out closer together. Let me give you just a couple of examples, specific examples to illustrate. So before the referendum, I was invited to attend a city gathering. Many people that I like and respect were there, and they'd done a very smart thing. They'd commissioned a number of focus groups, not to just ask people which way they were going to vote in the referendum, but they asked them what arguments were resonating with them. The conclusion, the undisputed conclusion, was that the messages about the potential damage to the economy and to trade if we voted for Brexit simply weren't resonating. And the group in the room listened to this feedback, and instead of saying, how do we change the message, they just said, how do we say the message more loudly? Now, I have to say as well, as someone who did support leave, I've been made to feel in a very uncomfortable position all year, or at least I put myself in a very uncomfortable position. I, of course, am not anti-business, I'm not anti-immigration or inwards looking. And in fact, I wanted to leave because I have a real concern that the consensus among business to favour Remain could lead the country to make long-term economic mistake. And it's actually been a very Alice in Wonderland, very strange experience. There's been so much criticism of the EU, including by Remainers, and the empirical evidence is very damning, and yet I was made to feel very heretical, questioning things. I don't know if you read an article in The Telegraph by Matthew Lynn the other day. He described the social disaster of the Eurozone quite brilliantly, but albeit depressingly. He outlined the data around the shocking numbers of people at risk of poverty or social exclusion in Greece, Spain, and Italy, and he explained how those numbers have increased since the financial crisis. Literally, the social Europe that was so well envisaged, so enticingly envisaged by Jacques Delors in 1987, just tragically hasn't materialized. Instead, as Matthew Lynn put it, the EU has become a poverty machine. But the reality is that within the city, dissenting views around our membership, even of this very challenged framework, have not been welcome. And groupthink has again prevailed. Now, the definition of groupthink, of course, is not simply just mass agreement, but the more pernicious state of affairs in which dissenting views are excluded and even ridiculed. So on the EU, conventional wisdom may well have been wrong and put business in a difficult place in the aftermath of the vote, but it has been heresy to question it. Now, I was trained as an active fund manager. Before I was the CEO, I ran bond fund money, and I was trained to look for flaws in the conventional wisdom. And so I find it perplexing and worrying that one is supposed to leave the questioning alone around the very big issues. And I think it's time to connect the dots. When orthodoxy is rejected, great things can happen, from Copernicus and Galileo to Charles Darwin and John Snow, whose skepticism pinpointed cholera's cause to contaminated water rather than bad air. And I think now is the time very much to reject the orthodoxy and to focus on how we can repair the fractured relationship between business and society in a more thoughtful and listening way. We need to reach out to form a better understanding about the perspective of those who voted to leave. The referendum result has in many ways been simplistically interpreted as attributable to a less well-educated section of society, and that they were swayed by a false and nationalistic dogma. And completely contrasting to that, I've met trade unionists in recent weeks who talk extremely eloquently about the loss of identity and belonging. That was a strong factor in their communities in the voting. And that is something that surely can resonate with everyone and give us some common ground on which to build a shared vision. I heard a well-respected journalist who writes for a very well-respected newspaper say on the stage the other day that the role of such journalists and such publications was to stand against populism by delivering international and progressive views. And my heart really sank. Such a view is incredibly condescending. It widens and not narrows the duality. And that same speaker and others on the stage that night spoke about their shock and sadness at the events of this year. But that diagnosis and their approach, I believe, will only lead to more shock and sadness. We need to engage with populist movements, not push them away. Now, of course, one reason to be hopeful is that the new Prime Minister is changing the political narrative around the perpetuation of this divide. She is demanding prosperity for the many, not the few. She is suggesting workers on boards. She is critical of executive remuneration. And she is questioning quantitative easing. In her closing speech at the Conservative Party conference, she described the impact of QE. People with assets got richer. People without them have suffered. People with mortgages have found their debts cheaper. People with savings have found themselves poorer. And vitally, Theresa May is demanding the upholding of the democratic result of the referendum, even if perhaps the evidence suggests she might herself have preferred a Remain result, and despite the setback in the High Court last week. The legal case, I think, is a very unfortunate setback in many ways, because it reopens the wounds. It reopens the divisions that had been healing since the referendum. And again, I think it's symptomatic of our very familiar and very flawed confrontational approach. But the Prime Minister's ideas about a new form of capitalism and greater social inclusion remind us that the future need not be more of the same. We can fight the old bourgeoisie versus the proletariat battle, or, as I said earlier, we can choose otherwise. And I think it depends on you, on us, particularly if you're involved in corporate social responsibility. But perhaps you might feel it is treated as important in name only. You have relatively little exposure, perhaps at board or CEO level, and perhaps you only have a small budget. So my call to you is, my suggestion is it's time to move centre stage. Because if we rewind back to that sitting meeting that I mentioned that happened before the referendum, what might have happened, what could have led to a different outcome, or perhaps just a better understanding, was that those leaders recognized that they weren't connecting, and they listened and they reached out and they learned from other perspectives. They could have moved from force to inspiring, from confrontation to empathy. Now, that might sound much easier said than done, and you might feel it's very vague and too naive an aspiration. So I want to spend my final few minutes just outlining a possible way forwards. Duality, or seeing a false dichotomy or an overly simplistic binary way of looking at the world, good against bad, as if those states have no relationship with each other, is deeply ingrained in each of us. It is in me as well as in you. So we describe ourselves as left-wing or right-wing. We believe in market or state-led economies. We are cautious or risk-takers, introvert or extrovert. And even though we all know really that we are mixtures of all of those attributes and beliefs. And that also we know that no simple economic or political model has ever worked. Now I believe, and it's one reason, a main reason why I spent so much time and effort on the gender equality, is it's quite sort of deep back, the philosophy behind that, because I believe that the male-female divide over many centuries, developed over many centuries, is very strongly linked to our tendency to see the other, to develop one-sided opposing views. Effectively, for centuries, one half of society, really around the world, has at least implicitly been seen as superior to the other, and therefore dominating in power. And if we see one half of the world as inferior, or as a second sex, as Simone Beauvoir put it, we are almost inevitably conditioned towards a tendency to discriminate and exclude. And it is deeply embedded in all of us. It's, as I said, the reason why I have focused really on, can we get a better balance between the genders? Because I do think that holds the key to a more inclusive approach. Now, inclusive approach doesn't mean we're all the same, doesn't mean we lose any difference of opinion. That can be in itself so valuable, that genuine diversity of belief and thought can be so valuable in iterating towards the truth. And I do subscribe to the current neuroscience view, I'm not a neuroscientist, of course, that on average women are more empathetic, more systematic, and that together we are stronger. And of course, feminine attributes, which men can have too, those ways of working, are ever more useful in today's networked world, that world where the power is changing, where your leadership title does not enable you to simply tell people what to do. And where each of us needs to create that empathy, that buy-in to earn a real following and real power. And if we can rebalance those masculine and feminine traits, if we can create unity between us, then, and in our way of treating each other and work towards underlying shared goals, then I'm convinced we can be more inclusive in our behaviours. Now, take globalization, more nationalistic economic policies. We've seen over the past half century, and it's obviously very much in the news about whether we should retrench from globalization or be more local. We've seen that there are many problems with both. And I think instead of arguing about that, it's time for a serious, united discussion about the elements of a productive human life that we share and we want to preserve or nurture for future generations. And then we can consider how to build an economic model and the political or governance structure that can help us achieve those goals. I don't think there would be much disagreement over the need for earning and belonging, to develop skills that are valued and relevant, for healthy families and communities, ethical behaviours, kindness to our fellow citizens, incentives for virtue rather than vice, sustainable profits over short-term gains, and for higher productivity and fairer rewards. And also a more sophisticated and less confrontational foreign policy that's open to the reality that our world is moving to a more multipolar space, And the UK has a wonderful opportunity to be more significant as an independent participant in global politics. Now, there is a rush of excellent initiatives at present aiming at developing this thoughtful approach. It's not just pie in the sky. There's lots of people thinking about what does a healthy society look like. So I would include the Common Good Foundation established by Lord Glassman, the Big Innovation Centre's Purposeful Company, the Institute for Public Policy Research's soon-to-be-announced Commission for Economic Justice, and of course our own government's sweeping review of corporate governance. I believe, like the gender equality movements over the past few years, there's now a different pace and depth to these efforts hitherto. I see more questioning and a search for real answers. But we do need a more joined-up approach. Progress in one area can so easily be undermined elsewhere. I mentioned earlier the disconnect that felt very personal to me between the railing against groupthink that caused the financial crisis and then the exclusion of different views around the EU. On perhaps a more micro scale, there is often adherence to the requirements, unquestioned adherence to the requirements of the Corporate Governance Code in this country, but often resistance, for example, to publish more data to offer transparency around equal pay and diversity. I see companies sign up to diversity initiatives, then cut the budgets at the first sign of any financial pressure. I see talk about how people are the most valued asset, but then HR relegated to more of a support function. And I see CSR treated often as more nice to have than as essential, highly funded and embedded in the strategy of the business. So, my conclusion, I would urge you to seize your moment now that the Prime Minister has escalated these issues right up the agenda, to your issues as well as hers, to make it absolutely clear to your CEO, to your board, that there needs to be a very thoughtful and extensive embedding of talk into action, that we need to present on how companies can join up the dots, not to have gaps, to get ahead of issues like the gender pay gap, executive remuneration, workers on boards. The minimum price for lack of follow-through will be adverse publicity and eventual regulation. The prize for proactivity is huge, both for your business and for helping to heal our broken society. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't you sit over there, Stephen?
So thank you very much, Helena, and good evening, everyone. As Jim said, I'm Michael Skopinka from the Financial Times. What we're going to do now is have a panel discussion. I'm going to talk to our panelists and then open it up to all of you. So let me just begin by introducing our panel. Sitting right next to me, we have Wanda Wiepawska, who is Executive Director of the Equality Trust. Next to Wanda is Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP and author of a very interesting paper quite recently on our subject, where he examined what the proper relationship should be between the Labour Party and business and between society and business. Next to Stephen, we have Antoni Bayabriga, who is Global Head of Responsible Business at the Spanish banking group BBVA, and Helena we've already met. Stephen, could I start with you, just because I'd like to pick up one of the specifically political points that Helena made, and she referred, and I think we were all aware of it, to the fact that when she went to a meeting of business leaders, people didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that people weren't listening to the economic arguments when it came to opposing Brexit. And just thought that the answer was to speak more loudly. Now, you were obviously on the other side of the debate to Helena. What was your view, what is your view about why that message from business did not get through?
I think the problem with the referendum campaign from the point of view of the Remain side was that it focused too much on the risks of leaving rather than accentuating the opportunities of staying. And it failed to set out a compelling vision for what the future for the United Kingdom would be in a deeply interconnected world. It failed to set out that an interdependent bloc like the European Union is actually directly aligned with the reality of the world in which we live. As Winston Churchill said, the world, for the United Kingdom, there are three majestic circles. There's our influence in Europe, our influence in terms of our relationship with the United States, and our influence in terms of our relationship with the Commonwealth. And his point was always that if you depart strategically from one of those circles, you will lose your place across all three of them. And I think those words that he spoke decades ago are even more true today than they were then. So I think that what we should have been doing is talking much more positively and optimistically about the fact that actually since the creation of the European Union, Europe has seen decades of uninterrupted growth. The idea that the European Union is a poverty machine is absurd. It's delivered decades of peace. It is the only organization that has managed to keep the countries of Europe from fighting with each other for a very substantial period of time. And so I think we needed to, in addition to sort of talking about the economic realities of the shock, it'll be a slow burn shock, but it'll be a slow burn that eventually everybody will feel in this country. Of course, that's an important part of the choices that people make. They've got to weigh up the risks and the opportunities. But we should have talked much more about a positive future for the United Kingdom in an interdependent Europe within an interdependent world.
But let me just pick you up on this one point. I mean, I'm sure many people would agree with you that a positive case wasn't made, but there were very, very significant warnings, not just from business leaders within the UK, but from the OECD, from the IMF, from everybody really. All expert opinion was saying this is going to be damaging to you. And yet that message wasn't believed, which seems to suggest people saying, I hear what you're saying, I just don't believe you. I mean, what lies behind that disbelief that we see?
Yeah, I think that that's the difference between the abstract and the lived experience. So I represent a constituency which is very much what you describe as a white working class constituency. We have the biggest steelworks in the country in my constituency. Less than 2% of the population of my constituency was born outside the UK. And yet there are constantly questions and concerns being raised about immigration. And so you realise that this is something which is it's a lived experience, not really based on what the experts, so to speak, are saying. It's more based on what people feel about their future and where it's going. And I think the other point I would make is that I think it's actually amazing that we got 48%. In this country, we've seen decades of the media bashing the European Union whenever they got a chance. We've seen decades of politicians taking credit on a national level whenever things go right, and then blaming the EU when they go wrong. And we've also seen a country where people's wages have stagnated since 2007. That's the longest period since the Industrial Revolution. When you put those factors together, no wonder people said, you know what, you're trying to get me to vote for the status quo. Well, the status quo doesn't work for me. Why should I vote for it? And I think there's a fundamental difference between what I would call the economy and my economy. So the Remain campaign said, leaving the EU will be bad for the economy. And people said, well, there's a massive difference between the economy and my economy, because what I see is that a small number of people seem to have done quite well from globalization, deindustrialization, the technology revolution, and I haven't. So I'm going to vote based on my perception of my own interest. I think the tragedy of it is that it'll be those very people that will suffer more than anybody else as the true impact of Brexit is felt.
And let me bring in you in here, because Stephen has spoken about people's lived experience. I mean, from your point of view, is that lived experience one of glaring inequality, growing inequality? How do you see that? And what is the impact on people's ability to believe in the future?
Well, I think the connection is really lack of trust, and this is a thread that runs through everything, and what Helena was saying as well, that people don't trust big business, people don't trust experts, because they see that, 10% of the UK wealth, is the top 10% of people who have, the top 10%, have 45% of the wealth, and the bottom 10% have 1%. And so it's very difficult to align those areas, to be able to say that, to think that those people, those experts, actually have your interests at heart, or even understand your life. I mean, if we look at the top 1%, we'll see that they're 80% male, they're 80% white, male, between 50 and 64. And to be in that top 1%, you're earning £160,000 a year if you're a childless couple in terms of a household. So it's a very, very different experience than that of most people on the ground. And that gap is getting larger and larger. And as the gap between people gets larger and larger, then they have more invested on trying to stay on the rung of that ladder that they're at, because falling down is a long way.
Right. Now, you've got an international perspective on this. This has been a problem in the UK for many years. The United States had a different attitude to these differences of wealth. The idea was if you were at the bottom of the pile, you could rise up to the top. What we seem to be seeing in the election could be a far bigger earthquake, the Brexit that we're looking at. People no longer believe in that either. Why do you think that has happened? It seems to be more than a UK phenomenon.
Well, I think, you know, the American dream is anything but, because the US is one of the most unequal countries. So, you know, if you want the American dream, you should really go to Norway. We should be talking about the Norwegian dream. So I think it is that lack of trust, and it's that lack of belief. As Stephen was saying, people see that it's their economy, it's what's happening in their life. And I think to some extent social media has a role to play. I'm a great fan of social media, but there have always been massive differences between rich people and poor people, but we didn't have it thrust in our face quite so often as now. 30 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to look at a £4 million engagement ring that a Kardashian has. Now, you know, it can come into my phone and I can think, oh, that's quite nice, or I wouldn't mind that. You know, we're actually, it's a lot more in our faces, I think, and we see that wealth and we see that display of wealth, and I think that does have an effect.
And Tony, can I just bring you in here? I mean, I suppose we saw some of these movements and some of this discontent. We saw it in Spain perhaps earlier than in other countries, and we've seen it across Europe. Do you think this is a Europe-wide phenomenon, an international phenomenon? And perhaps you could say something about the slight disagreement between Stephen and Helena about whether the EU is a poverty machine as well.
No, exactly. In Spain, we have suffered a very deep crisis, especially for the mortgage market, just starting in the year 2007. And yeah, I totally agree that we had strong movements on the streets, you know, asking for new regulations, new laws. I think that the country has evolved significantly, but you see, just a few years ago, you had as an activist Ada Colau, who was a leader for the, let's say, to defend the rights of the owners of houses and affected by mortgages. Today, Ada Colau is the mayor in Barcelona. So you can see how everything is changing, no? And I think that is something that is going to happen. Ellen comment that you cannot accept this as a reality. You have to be proactive and see how companies, how we can engage better, no? And rebuild this new contract, social contract, no? Otherwise, we are going to be lost. Today, we have a world completely hyper-connected, hyper-transparent. So the relationship is totally balanced today. It's not as before. So that traditional symmetry between companies and society has changed completely. So I think that challenge also happened in Spain, also in UK and everywhere in the world at the end of the day. No?
Helena, can I just bring you in at this point and just extend that conversation you started about the way we speak to each other and the way opponents speak to each other and this binary you and us attitude. I mean, can I just ask you, first of all, after the referendum, do you think the Leave winners have spoken to the losers, the Remainers, in a way which reaches out to them?
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. I was pretty much ostracized immediately after the result. My husband and I went to a friend's party thing, and well, they sat me next to the only other person who was an obvious leaver, and embarrassed us in the speech that they made. Now, I'm not, getting my violin out. I mean, that was kind of, but it was not. It was very odd because these are our friends. I think other people have told me, whichever side they were on, that it became very contentious. Now, I would like to think, although I can't prove this, that if Remain had won, I would just got on with life and said, oh, well, that's what people voted. It's a democratic result. And actually, it was, as I say, it was a very sort of strange experience because I have no desire to have any ill on the country or people who live in it. I genuinely felt, like I have done with big investments over the years, that what everyone's thinking is not necessarily, just to be taken on face value, and we should at least question. And I have started, I used to run European bond money and so forth, and seeing how we went from, very strong convergence of yields, but also seeing how then there were no safety valves in Europe for sort of social pressures and so forth, because there's no fiscal union or political union. So I felt, it was very uncomfortable, very difficult time. So I would have liked to reach out and be heard, but literally it was very hard to get my voice out. So like tomorrow there's a big City UK dinner and I've written a piece for it, but it's not been very easy.
Okay, we don't want to get stuck on Brexit tonight because it's not really the center of our discussion, but just this question of how we speak to each other, and just to come back to this, because it's been remarked on in the case of the US election, people are no longer talking to each other. They're talking to themselves. Social media seems to have accentuated this idea that people live within their bubbles. It seems to have got worse, and I wonder how you think we get past that.
So, although it's hard to explain, I do think we need to go back to, trying to establish some common ground. Like in a debate where you're having a big argument with someone, you peel back the layers of the onion until you can find something that you agree on. And I do think that people would want a healthy future, or a strong future for their children, that they want to have a sense of belonging, they want to have security. There's a lot of characteristics that everyone would share. And I think the only way forward is to try to connect on that level before we try to develop, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? One thing I don't really understand about politics, which perhaps Stephen can enlighten me on, is that everything seems to be a lot of the rush, everything seems to be a lot of a rush, that there's no sort of time for reflection sometimes, and there's this happening and that happening, and the diary's full, and people, who want to talk to you then give you 33 seconds, when these are very big issues. So I'm enjoying being part of Lord Glassman's Common Good Foundation, and there are these seminars that go on for several hours where we just discuss historical precedents, we discuss, particular economists, and it's you might feel it's a bit purposeless because we're not kind of coming up with a series of action points, but I feel it's the necessary step before we can then devise a better model.
Stephen, you've obviously had a lot of experience of speaking to people, constituents or otherwise, who disagree with you. Do you see a way forward? Do you see how we get past this divide and start speaking to each other again?
I think that one of the fundamental problems we have in this country is our electoral system, actually. I'm a big fan of a shift to proportional representation. I think that first past the post is inimical to developing the kind of political culture that Helena was just outlining, which is much more based on compromise being a sign of strength, consensus building being a necessity if you're going to be able to form a majority in Parliament, reaching out across different party divides in order to build that consensus. And I think that what happened with the referendum was we actually had millions of people in this country who, for the first time ever, their vote counted. Every vote in the referendum counted, whereas we've had, absurdly in this country, since God was a boy, a system whereby people, millions of votes in this country are quote-unquote wasted votes because you're in a quote-unquote safe seat, and so it doesn't make much difference either way in terms of who gets elected. So I think that would be one quite practical way forward, and I think we need a change, because the fact is, in the 1950s, 90-odd% of the people who voted for one of the big two parties, Labour or Conservative. That figure has dropped to 61, 62% now. So the tectonic plates have shifted underneath our political system, but our political system has utterly failed to catch up with it. And I think to some extent you're seeing similar pressures in the United States, which also has a first-past-the-post system. Now, of course, we're seeing the rise of populism in countries like France and the Netherlands and the Nordic countries, which do have proportional representation. But I feel that the debate there allows that voice and engages. I think, as Helena was saying in the speech, you can't just pretend the populists aren't there. I think, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's get out there, let's have that discussion, let's have that vote. And suddenly you see also what's very interesting, sometimes you see these insurgents becoming the establishment. And what's been fascinating to see since the referendum is that the Brexiteers who, you know, the Bill Cashes, the Jacob Rees-Moggs of this world, the David Davis of this world, who were always the rebels, the insurgents, you know, the rebels without a cause. Well, now they are actually the establishment. And so it's been very good, I think, for our democracy to put those guys in the hot seat and say, okay, it's up to you. Show us the way.
Yeah. And Tony, Helena talked about everything being done in a rush in politics. I mean, Spain can't be accused of having formed a government in a rush.
Yes, after 1 year.
Looking at it from your perspective and from that perspective, do you see British politics as being particularly polarized in the way that Stephen has said?
Absolutely. I mean, we see that that is the key point. It seems that nobody listened to the other one, no? And it's difficult to start combining a common ground, no? I have been traveling just 2 months ago to Colombia, where we had also there. We have a bank there, and the society was also polarized, no? Because of also for the voting regarding the peace process, no? And it was surprising to see that small difference and how the society is so polarized, no? And it's very difficult, no? In terms of a CSR practitioner, because at the end of the day, I'm here as a CSR practitioner, what the challenge that we have is how we can engage better with society and to break that, this, as I said, no, this relationship, and how we can listen better to the different stakeholders we have around our business, no? And recognize that movements. And that's, I think, you can have two strategies, or you can, be reactive, or you can be proactive and trying to develop the future you want, no? I always say that there is the stairway to hell, in certain way. It happens in a lot of companies, in a lot of contexts, but you make bad decisions maybe internally. Then you have social movements or media pressure. Then you have intervention from politicians about a specific topic, and at the end you have regulation. So we can say, okay, I am not going to do nothing. I am going to wait and defend and not react. Or you can be part of this stairway and see how you can engage with all the stakeholders involved and see how you can create better future. No? I think that's the approach that the responsible companies should have, no? And that is what's required. But it requires also this capacity of listening, understanding and recognizing the other, and see how we can build together. Huh?
Werner, let me bring you in at that point, because I think Antony raised a very interesting, moves into a very interesting area here. We've been talking about political polarization. We don't have the same kind of industrial conflict, the same kind of conflict between companies and trade unions, between companies and workers that we had maybe 20 years ago. You've got a trade union background as well. Do you think business has actually seen more talking than politics has?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, as you say, I mean, I've been a trade unionist since I was 18 years old. I've worked at the TUC and I've worked for a leading education trade union. And I think, you know, an unfortunate part of something that's contributed to growing to inequality has been the loss of the power of trade unions, in a sense, because that collectivism and, again, coming back to trust, the trust that you have with your fellow workers, and that, you know, leads us on to the issue of workers on boards and that sort of thing, but people working together, people feeling that they have a common interest. And I think one of the things about the so-called gig economy and 0 hours contracts is that people are working in different ways and not likely to see each other. And this is part of how industry has changed. Obviously, it was far easier to organise when you had factories or people working in one place, working in the same hours. And I think it's a great loss, actually, to business that trade unions aren't gaining as many members as they should be. And I think it's part of what Helena was saying as well, that, you know, it's not a question of leaders versus workers, but very often it's seen like that by workers. And it's no surprise if you've got the CEOs of FTSE 100 on 6 million and the lowest paid worker in the organisation valued at 1/3% of that salary, then there is a huge gap there.
Stephen, you represent an area with very deep trade union roots, and yet we were talking before we came up here, you were saying how everybody at Tata Steel has really managed to improve productivity, work together. Do you think things have improved or deteriorated in industry or in business generally?
Well, I would agree with Vanda. I deeply regret the decline of collective bargaining and a mature, sober and constructive industrial relations culture in this country. I think it actually lies at the heart of many of our problems because as a result of that, we've had to introduce the minimum wage. In a mature collective bargaining culture, you don't even need minimum wage legislation because those terms are set by a tripartite conversation between government and employers and trade unions every year. They set the terms and conditions, they set the salary, and it is the key to having an engaged and productive workforce. So there is a structural weakness in the British. I mean, only about 30% of our labour market is covered by collective bargaining compared to an EU average of 65%. And in the Nordic countries, you're up at 80-90%, and no surprise, they're the most productive economies in Europe. So it's not rocket science. What it requires is some deep restructuring and thinking about the way in which our economy works. And clearly, business, government, and the trade union movement should all play their part in that. But if we want to get away from the kind of yaboo relationship that's developed between employers and workforces since the 1980s, we do need to think very hard about that industrial relations culture. And what I think the trade unions, the Community Union, which is the main steelworkers union, they've demonstrated that even in that vacuum in terms of a proper industrial relations culture, the workforce has stepped up. There's been some swinging redundancy programs in the steelworks. They've cut costs, they've improved productivity, they're turning that steelworks around. And I'm very, very proud to be the Member of Parliament for a constituency with such a fantastic and committed workforce. But I do think that there's, in terms of, it reflects this broader need, I think, in our economy and in our politics to move to a more consensus-based culture. And I think electoral reform would be an important part of that. Legislating for more collective bargaining would be a very positive step in the right direction. I also think there's a strong case for a reform of the Companies Act, whereby a clause should be inserted into that act, which actually what I would call a balanced purpose clause, which is where you can't incorporate a company unless you have a clear statement of purpose based on people, planet, and profit. And that can be used that's then within the shareholders to ensure that any big decision that the company is making has to be aligned with that clause, and also would block the incredible number of foreign takeovers we have in this country. We have by far the highest number of foreign takeovers in the advanced economic world, industrialized world. And I don't think that's necessarily helpful, because I think it leads to a very short-termist business culture, what Hillary Clinton calls quarterly capitalism, where you're constantly running to deliver to the bottom line and to your shareholders on a quarterly basis, rather than thinking long-term about what kind of R&D do I need? What are my skills investments? What new technologies do I need? What should be my industrial relations culture? Building companies of purpose rather than quarterly capitalism. I think that's something where government and business should come together and set that path out.
I think there's quite a lot that Stephen said that we're going to want to unpack. But if I could just start with you, Helena, do you think one of the problems that we have and one of the reasons that we have such an adversarial culture is that we don't have enough trade union involvement?
Well, I certainly, as I mentioned briefly earlier, my experiences of dealing with people in the trade union movement have been entirely positive in recent months, and some very clear, thoughtful, articulate views coming through that have deepened my understanding and playing the listening role. I do think that a lot of what Stephen has said around, there's obviously a review at the moment of whether we should be opening up the Companies Act again around directors' duties and so forth. But I think ultimately, if companies won't do it themselves, then we kind of have to legislate. And I do think it would be better to have bargaining power that was collectively, not so enforced. It just seems to me we're not getting proactive enough within businesses. We're kind of waiting for someone to tell us what to do. I do think, perhaps I could add as well, I think investors have a part to play in this, to play a bigger part than they have hitherto, in terms of not being sort of peripheral to the main event about, ESG, CSR type issues, but actually linking profit with purpose in how we analyze companies, talking about human capital and the value of intangibles, including talent. So there's a whole series of joined up things that could be done to just humanize it more.
You've both spoken about the possibility of a change in the law and restating companies' purpose by law, but companies talk about this anyway, don't they? There are very few companies who haven't got something they say, we're here for society. Companies got all their CSR programs, all of their outreach programs. What is it that stops people from following through? As you've said, companies cut their CSR programs. What is holding them back?
Yeah, I wish I knew, because I do think there's just still a sense that it's not the mainstream inextricably linked to the success of the company. I don't think anyone ever would say that. But actually, when push comes to shove and they're sort of saying, well, actually, going back to the quarterly capitalism, I'm either going to deliver the earnings this quarter or I'm going to cut this, and this to make sure I sneak under the wire and I have, a good reception. We just haven't had the sort of realization that actually sustainable competitive advantage is inextricably linked to doing the right thing and to thinking longer term. And I say investors perhaps have part to blame because they are quarterly in their focus as well. Everybody needs to push out horizons. And I do despair sometimes, because I think, I see it lots of times. People say, well, we haven't got any money this year for our diversity programs because, we feel we've done enough there. Whereas they've still got only 10% women at the top, or very little socioeconomic diversity, or whatever, ethnicity and so forth. It's the first to go, despite these fine words.
Yeah.
So maybe someone in the audience can enlighten us as what's
we will
happening
come
behind
to
the
the audience very
scenes.
shortly. Vanda, any thoughts on this, on whether a change in company purpose would make a difference?
Yes, I think, Section 172, if we strengthened that and actually took notice of the fact that, the profit is what you get after you've looked after the interests of the other stakeholders, in a sense. And employees are stakeholders. Employees are far more likely to stick around. They have a far more interest in the company actually carrying on long term. It's their bread and butter, literally. So I think we should include that and be far stronger on that.
Right, let's open up a bit. Are there any questions or any thoughts or any comments so far? Please raise your hand if there's a question you'd like to put to the panel. Yes, and if you could just wait for a microphone to come to you, and if you could please just tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Martin Summers from Blade & Moore, and thank you very much for some really good contributions. I was wondering what you should think about CEOs and chairmen saying a bit more in public on political and social matters. There's only really a handful who really go out of their way to have a profile and a program where they raise these issues quite directly, which seems odd because most companies have huge amounts on their websites and elsewhere about society, diversity, the environment, but very few of them step up to the plate on this. And I was wondering why you think that so many CEOs seem to be slightly wary of this and what could be done about it.
Anthony, what's your view on that? Why are CEOs so shy about speaking up about politics?
No, I think at the end of the day, it depends on the industry. A lot of industries are very regulated, so you have to maintain a certain level of neutrality, and so you want to always base your opinions on facts, and at the end, that's quite normal. But in certain cases, at least the experience that we have in Spain, in certain cases, obviously, companies take a specific part of when there is a debate on that, and make some proposals as well, no? And then obviously the politicians take the decisions that they have to take, no? I think it's something that is natural. I mean, not a problem, but obviously depends on the industry.
Helena, I mean, we saw some CEOs speaking out. On the other hand, we saw many CEOs, both during the Brexit referendum and during the Scottish independence referendum, saying, we don't want to take a position because we don't want to alienate those of our customers who disagree with us. Do you think it's helpful for CEOs to speak out in this way?
Well, I think less controversially than obviously on social issues, it's hard to explain why you wouldn't talk about things that would be a benefit to society generally. I do think you can make a case either way. One is if you feel it's going to be very detrimental, an outcome on a political issue, then it seems responsible if you're delivering returns and so forth. or at least it's not black and white again. But I think on social issues, it's hard to understand why people are so reticent. I do think, I'm going to get myself in trouble again, aren't I, if I say this, but PR departments, in companies or teams often seem to be very cautious as well and advise against sort of taking positions. And yet I think that's misjudging the mood. I think that, again, we'd build trust better if people were seen as human beings that had views, particularly on things that seem to matter to lots of people, rather than just being a corporate machine. And
do you think there's a danger, though, those that do speak out, they develop a reputation for being positive forces in society and then have to make business decisions which maybe contradict that? I'm thinking particularly of Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, one of the best known, probably the best known socially responsible CEO. He spoke about Brexit. He speaks about all sorts of social issues. He sometimes calls himself the head of an NGO and calls Unilever an NGO. And yet, when it came to the fact that the pound had deteriorated, the pound had dropped, Unilever reports its profits in euros. When he announced, look, I'm going to have to raise the price of Marmite and Hellmann's mayonnaise, he was suddenly seen as the big bad wolf. Is that part of the danger for them?
well, I think in that case it was particularly perplexing because no one could work out how Marmite had anything to do with the euro exchange rate. Because
except, as I say, they report their profits in euros.
Profit. Yeah, no, I think it is no. I think it's a question of if you don't speak up about anything, it's like no risk, no reward, or if you feel it's just the downside. But I don't see that that's a downside that's problematic particularly. I think if you actually believe in certain things and you are a business leader, a responsible business leader, and you think it's important, then that has to outweigh the sort of inconvenience where there's some micro issue that might, cause you to look foolish or be held up as sort of not being consistent. I mean, there are others, Nigel Wilson at Legal & General is very consistent. They put their money where their mouths are. They build a big on infrastructure projects. I mean, as long as your core is true and you're not just making it up, then I think that's just, part and parcel of the business world of handling, small issues, or maybe they're big sometimes. But if you've got to just be consistent, not just peripheral, superficial rather.
Stephen, what's your view on that?
Well, I think that it is an issue of legitimacy. And in order to be able to speak out with credibility, you've got to have that legitimacy. And people will be looking to you to practice what you preach. So clearly, we're not going to get Philip Green talking about the financial viability of pension funds, for example. So I think, and Paul, I know Paul, I've seen him when I worked before going into politics. I worked at the World Economic Forum, and Paul was always the big draw at Davos because he was somebody that was able to articulate the vision for the future. He was able to set out that compelling vision, and he was able to say, look, I said when I took over I wouldn't do quarterly business reporting, and I said to the board of Unilever, I won't take the job if you force me to do it. And that caused a big ruckus, but he stuck to his guns, and he was then able to give Unilever a far more long-term strategic business model. He said, my objective is to cut our carbon footprint by half and to double our market cap. And I understand he's on the way to achieving that. So I think what he's very good at is saying you can do well by doing good. And that's got to be a critical message that goes out there in terms of the broad overarching narrative. Now, if occasionally there are tactical business decisions that have to be made that run against that, one would hope that people will have enough pragmatism to understand that you can't always be perfect every single day of the week. There's very few walks of life where you're able to do that. So I think what leaders, business leaders such as Paul and people in other walks of public life need to be able to say is, look, the market economy works because it delivers growth, and growth is at the heart of what we want to achieve. But it's not been delivering the right kind of growth. And so we've got to look at issues of sustainability. We've got to look at our relationship with the rest of society, because we understand that a healthy relationship between society and business is absolutely essential. One can't survive without the other. So actually we're speaking out in terms of our own business interest by talking about our broader responsibilities, not just to our shareholders, but also to our stakeholders. And what we need is more business leaders like Paul who can make the business case for doing what he's doing. And I think people will come along. I mean, I saw recently the fund of 10 oil and gas companies have put $100 million in each to create $1 billion research program into carbon capture and storage. And it's a drop in the ocean in terms of their profit. But if we can start to also see the likes of the oil and gas companies moving in that direction, we need that kind of vanguard of business leaders who will push that forward. And if it doesn't happen, it'll from the kind of vanguard, it won't. We need to also ensure that it's a bottom-up process as well, but those two have got to come together. So I think it's essential.
Wanda, do you think people take business leaders' pronouncements on this on trust, or do you think it just breeds cynicism?
Well, I think it depends who it is. I mean, I think there are business leaders who do have that trust, but I think it also correlates to executive pay. I mean, I was at an event when Lord Miners said he'd love to ask Martin Sorrell what he did for that extra million. What would he do for 77 million that he wouldn't do for 76? And I think when we're looking at astronomical figures like that, which are just out of the range, they're stratospheric for most people, and it's very difficult. I mean, I agree with Stephen that, you know, business is part of the community, it's part of society. It draws on society for its educated workforce. It cannot be separate. And I think part of that action of rebuilding trust is to really shout about more of the good things that business are doing. If you're paying living wage, then get accredited. If you've got lower pay ratios, then again, you can get accredited. Or if you're paying fair tax, work with Fair Tax Mark. There are a number of things that business can do to show people that it is taking these issues seriously. And I think business has a big job to do to rebuild that trust.
Yes, there's a hand right at the back, if we could just wait for the microphone.
Hello, Nick Davis from Neighbourly. So we've talked at the moment about the drivers for change being CEOs or investors or legislation, but the group that is citizens, that is customers, has a huge amount of power to lead and drive change. And yet we've got a huge challenge there of activating people, of educating them, of empowering them to take this position. Why aren't consumers being more active in rewarding the companies that seem to be on the journey towards change and buying from them, and actively not buying from those laggards who aren't on that journey? Does society just not care enough? How do we activate people to care?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, people in the CSR field often talk about the 330 phenomenon. 30% of people say that they make ethical decisions, they take ethical considerations into account when they make their consumer purchases. In fact, only 3% of people do. What do you think lies behind this lack of consumer engagement, if there is a lack of consumer engagement, Helena?
Well, I wonder, because obviously it might be that people know and they don't care enough to sort of vote with their pocket, but I do think sometimes people aren't aware that they don't realise when they buy some, say, very low-cost clothes, for example, that there might be sweatshops involved, or they just don't think through what has happened to get to this point. And I guess I would suggest that there's an effort on the part of the companies that have got a very responsible sort of supply chain and so forth to actually promote that and to explain why then their products might be a little more expensive, or why there might be, you know, there's something extra to be gained. I just don't see that particularly in how, you know, people market as well, companies market. So I'm not putting the onus back on the companies particularly, but I'm wondering if there's an opportunity that we haven't used yet to showcase the good companies and to get them saying that part of their message stronger.
Is that the issue, Wanda? Or, I mean, particularly if we're going to see depreciation in the pound leading to increases in prices of imported goods, whether it's food or clothing or anything else, isn't it just the case that basically people have to make decisions based on their family's finances?
I think that's very true. And I think, you know, many of us are in a position where we are educated enough to know about what the good companies and the bad companies. But I think for a lot of people, it comes down to budget. They buy what they can afford, and that's, you know, they're trying to make ends meet. And that's, I'm not saying there's no room for having ethics in that point, but I do think that when it comes down to putting food on your table or having an ethical stance and feeding your children, then, you know what people are going to do.
I would say that depends on the experience that we have, is that it depends on on the industry that you are, I mean, what is really material for your customers? I mean, at the end of the day, we did a survey just 2 years ago about asking for our customers and non-customers, what does it mean to be a responsible bank? And, well, they say, okay, it's important to give support to SMEs, to entrepreneurship, to fight against climate change, whatever, but the most important point is that you have to speak clear and transparent to your customers. As simple as that. So no small letter, very clear, no surprises. So if you fail on that, you fail the trust that you have as a financial supplier. No? So why don't customers change their bank? Because other issues, because this is the more nuclear point now, and this is how you create the trust. So I think there is a trend. In Spain, we have had suffer a very deep crisis, and I thought that Triodos Bank, which is called by themselves, I calling them as ethical banking, they grow a lot, 20%, 30%, but not enough. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets asking for new behavior from banks. But no one changed the bank. And I think that's something that is going to come, but at the end of the day, depends on each industry, which is really material for your customer. And if that is nothing wrong, you continue working on that. I mean,
Stephen, do you think we should expect more from consumers?
I think that will come almost organically. I think it's very difficult to kind of, by definition of the mass market, to dictate to the mass market. But I think we are seeing a perceptible, palpable rise in the rise of the aware consumer. I mean, I have 2 teenage daughters, and I hear them talking and thinking in very different ways about the kind of products they buy and provenance and certainly than I did when I was a teenager. So I think that there is a trend in the right direction. I hope so. But I'm also, a believer in technology. And I think that we're also, we need to keep investing in innovation, in research and development, to build the kind of products, that appeal to the consumer and are also more sustainable. And that is where, that investment in those long-term innovations is so critical, not just for the success of a business, but the survival of our planet. And that is the supply side of this equation. Clearly, there has to be supply and demand. The consumers provide that demand side. I think that awareness is slowly building. But a lot more needs to be done on the supply side to develop the kind of innovation. And I think that there's a big role for the public sector in that. The OECD average of public sector investment in research and development is 3%, and the UK is languishing at 1.7%. So a big commitment I'd like to see from this government, for example, particularly in the wake of Brexit and the need to reboot the British economy, is that we should be investing at least 3% of our GDP in research and development. And that, I think, and green energy and green infrastructure should be a major part of that.
Yes, let's take the hand just here in the middle. I think went up first.
Thank you. Simon Goldsmith from the University of Greenwich. Do we think there's a bit of a disconnect, really, between what some businesses say and what they actually do? We could look at, say, the right-wing press at the moment, whether it's the Daily Express, the Daily Mail. You've got lots of companies very willing to spend their money in advertising, media outlets that are essentially creating the broken Britain that we're talking about today. And I'm kind of wondering, really, whether these companies should be standing up and saying, no, actually, we won't, advertise in your papers because of the issues that they're creating. And I think that if we're looking at a kind of a broken, divided society, then those companies should also be asking some of the questions about where they put their money.
Thank you. Before we come back, let's take the other question that there was as well. There was a hand up there.
It's 2 quick ones. I'm Martin Wright. One to Helena Morrison. What would be the most straightforward, practical step, and who would take it, whether it be business or government, to try to heal the duality which you were very concerned about at the end of your opening speech? And one to Stephen Kinnock. What prospect do you think you have of persuading Labour Party colleagues to back your enthusiasm for electoral reform, particularly those who don't enjoy such healthy majorities as yourself?
Okay, well, let's take some of those questions. First of all, I have to say, as the representative of the newspaper industry on the panel, I don't know how much we've got to worry about, because newspaper advertising is in a deep decline, and we're having to make our money elsewhere, in our case through digital subscriptions and so on. But Stephen, I mean, a couple of political points there. First of all, do you think companies should be more discriminating about where they advertise, which newspapers they advertise in?
I mean, I think that it's, rather than have sort of sticking plaster and tactical solutions on this, I would take us back to my suggestion about a reform of the Companies Act. Because I think if we can come up with a clause in that act which says, in terms of incorporating as a company, you should be seeing your major business decisions through the following prisms, I think you'd have the answer to the question in that case. And I think it's up for every company to make that case, and to make that case to their board and to their shareholders, and take a balanced decision on what's right for the company, set against the 3 Ps: people, planet, profit. I think a shift to a triple bottom line model in terms of the way companies report, in terms of the decisions they make, otherwise we'll carry on having these tactical conversations, and there'll be 1 or 2 companies doing this or that. The balloon goes up in the air, and that's kind of the last you ever hear of it. What we need is to look at the fact that there is something wrong with the foundations of the way that corporate culture works in this country. This is a foundational, fundamental issue that needs to be addressed not only through legislation, but also through behaviour change. But I am of the view, I mean, I would say this, I'm a politician, that sometimes you need to pull a lever in order to ensure that behaviour changes. And in terms of, shall I do the electoral reform?
Yes, and just worth pointing out, we did have a referendum on electoral reform, which was lost, wasn't it?
Yeah, the problem with that referendum is it was actually a referendum on Nick Clegg. And unfortunately, that is what happens with referenda. I actually think that the way to move this forward is for those parties that sign up to electoral reform to put that in their manifestos. And if you can win an election, and there's an alliance of parties which form a majority in Parliament that have all supported electoral reform in their manifestos, in my view, that is the mandate to change the electoral system. In terms of whether I can persuade my colleagues in the Labour Party, I mean, I think that there is a growing move in the party. I think the referendum and the increasingly polarised nature of our politics, the emergence of new parties, you know, the Greens getting 1 million votes in May 2015 and 1 MP. UKIP, I mean, I'm certainly not a cheerleader for UKIP, but they got 4 million votes and 1 MP. I mean, that simply doesn't stack up. So I think there are a lot of my colleagues who know I'm right, but haven't quite got to the point of admitting it yet. I'll say that.
Let me pick up the other question, because I'd like to put it to each of you in turn. And this question was put to you, Helena, so let's start with you. You've answered some of this, but if there was one thing you could change which would close this gap between business and society, what would it be?
Yeah, I really don't think there is a completely magic bullet, I'm afraid. And I do think, in my own submission to the government on the corporate governance reforms, I have suggested a change to Section 172, but not in your lines, but more about how company directors should have equal, treat all the stakeholders equally. So that would be an overt change. And I have to admit that I'm for voluntary change, but I have got a bit worn down with people saying one thing and doing another. And I'm kind of thinking that an overt, and often people would say, well, I mean, I've heard cases where directors have said, well, we had to go with the shareholder short-term outcome, accept the bid, even though it destroyed jobs or it destroyed the community or it was long-term not good for the company, because we took legal advice and they said we would be in a breach or in danger of being sued by the shareholders. So I think there may be a leap for change there. I do think the other thing, going back to the listening point, is I do think businesses should listen to consumers a lot and have groups of customers and have feedback. Like you did a survey. I mean, I think people survey their employees and they kind of maybe use a third party, very distant. But I fell into a lot of home truths from just asking people their actual genuine views and not thinking I knew what they wanted. Can I just share, before we pass the baton, one little anecdote about proportional representation that swung me in the favour of proportional? So I have a lot of children, some of you might know that. 7 of them were at home. We were about to go out, my husband and I. They were arguing over what DVD to watch. They had 7 choices. 7, they couldn't, no 2 votes for one. And I listened at the door thinking I would have to break up the fight. But actually, and the eldest was 12 at this stage, they introduced, they're not brilliant children, this was just how they sorted themselves out, a system of proportional representation. Everyone had a first and second vote. And what was intriguing to me listening at the door was it went from complete, like, I thought they were going to kill each other, to accepting Ice Age as the outcome, as if they'd all chosen it. And I thought, wow, I was a convert from that point.
Just like the House of Parliament.
And they devised the system themselves.
They did, well, yes. Obviously, we're trying to work out how they were going to resolve the fact there were 7 movies out there and only one could be watched. But yeah, they did. It took a while to get to the one coming through. They just about had enough time to watch it. But
And Tony, if you could ask for one change, what would it be?
No, I think it's a cultural change at the end of the leadership of the companies. It's how we can connect with their mindset and to let them understand that society affects dramatically what they do, and they have a huge impact in people's lives, and how we can connect with them. The problem that we normally have, the ones we are working on CSR, is that we speak a language very difficult. We are 2 technicians, and sometimes we lose our key role, which is we are like a translator of what is happening outside the company, and try to understand and translate that information for the leaders, for the CEO, who later had to take better decisions. And if we don't connect with our CEO, with our leadership team, we are totally lost. I always say to my CEO that you pay me to break comfort zones, and I have to see how we can give you better and rich information to take better decisions. And I think that cultural mindset is the challenge that we have. Fortunately, we have, like Paul Polman or other CEOs that are really on the vanguard, but we are a lot of CEOs that they don't understand really that long-term vision yet. So, and I think that's the most important issue, and linked to a big purpose. I totally agree that the purpose-driven companies are really the future, and that's the way you can connect with your team. I think apart from investors, from consumers, from regulators, one driver for the change is employees. New millennials, they ask different behaviors from our companies. They don't accept to work on a undivided life as it was before. So they want to work in a company that has strong values aligned to and they get full of meaning, no? So I think there is a real opportunity there, no? Otherwise, you are not going to attract the talent you need. So I think that is another driver that is even more powerful on a short term than even consumers.
Wanda, what change would you like to see?
It's very difficult to define it as one change, but I think there has to be an absolute overhaul of the corporate system, but also that change in culture, because without that change in culture, people won't shift.
Okay, well, thank you all. I think that brings us to the end of this part of the discussion, so I'll hand the floor back to Jim.
Thank you, Michael. So, I mean, how does one draw conclusions from really a fascinating conversation? I think one thing that's very empowering is understanding stuff. Even if you can't change it, at least understanding it is important. I think something I really learned tonight was the power of collective bargaining, and actually what's happened when the trade unions receded from business is it's kind of left it more out to legislation now, and I think that's a very important point to understand in all of this, and it kind of takes us then back to the point that quite a lot of our conversations end up in, is this whole idea of shareholder primacy, and whether it's climate change or societal issues, it's that many of our businesses are run for the benefit of the shareholder and often the expense of society, and that can sometimes get a little bit depressing. But then on this issue, I think there's going to be a redress the relationship between business and society in a way that maybe there isn't on climate change, because we're already starting to see it through the polls. You know, we've got the Italian referendum coming up, where Renzi has become a referendum on the establishment, and Renzi may well lose. You've got the French polls coming up. We've got German polls coming up. You've got the poll tomorrow, and you're seeing the rise of the outsider. And this will have very strong consequences on business if it doesn't sort this out. So I think there's an immediacy on this issue that maybe there isn't on other issues. But I think you guys have captured it brilliantly. And clearly it's about listening and empathy sit right at the heart of this solution here. So thank you to all of you. It was a really fascinating discussion. And if I can just hold your time for quickly, things coming up for the crowd. On the 21st of November, we have X-Energy, which is really looking at how energy strategies can go exponential, looking at energy management meets tech disruption. It's a half day for experts or people in sustainability, energy facilities management. On the 5th of December, our next crowd, it is our Christmas event, so we always get a little bit silly, and we usually turn to Ed Gillespie for the compare, and we are doing it again this year. It is Mystic Ed's Crystal Balls, a look into 2017 and the big issues that will shape the agenda. And Ed has 6 clairvoyants who will be working with him: Aidan McQuaid on modern slavery, Jesse Baker on open data, Joe Francis on the global goals, Catherine Howarth on engaging investors, which is clearly crucial, Mike Barry on going local, and Caroline Hill on science-based targets. So it should be fun, but it should also be very important as we go into what will be a critical year. And on the 9th of January, for those who are really thinking ahead, we have an evening with Anthony Jenkins, the former CEO of Barclays, on responsible business in the digital age. Thank you very much. You guys have done a terrific job. Can we give them a big round of applause? So enjoy your roundtables. Well done. Great job.
That's all right.
That was very good.